So creatine is one of the most researched supplements on the planet. But one of the most common questions that I get asked about creatine is, does it cause hair loss or even make you go bald, especially if you have a genetic predisposition to this? So today we're going to be breaking down that, essentially, where the idea came from, what the latest research actually shows, what it means if you've had a hair transplant, and we'll also talk things like dosing and frequency and other factors that actually cause hair loss as well that often get overlooked. Now, I have also done 2 other videos on creatine, speaking to the benefits of creatine, and I've got the more common ones as well as the lesser known benefits. So feel free to check out those videos after this one if you haven't yet watched them and you want to know more. So where did this idea come from? So this whole idea around creatine causing hair loss comes from a single study back in 2009. So researchers gave college rugby players 25 grams of creatine per day for a week and then 5 grams a day for 2 weeks, I believe. Now in this study, they saw that DHT, which is a hormone linked to male pattern baldness, went up by about 56% during the loading phase, and then it stayed up at about 40% higher during maintenance. But here are some of the problems with this study. It was a very small study. It only lasted 3 weeks, and it never actually measured hair loss, only hormone responses. And on top of all of that, that study has never actually been replicated, but it did spark the idea that creatine makes you go bald, or is linked to that, or may trigger that. So what does the latest research actually say? So since that 2009 study, there have been dozens of peer-reviewed studies that have looked at creatine and hormone responses, and the majority, including long-term trials up until about 2023, show no consistent rise in DHT or testosterone as a result of taking creatine. So in other words, the hormonal effect that the 2009 study found hasn't actually been reproduced. And then in 2025, we actually finally got the study that everyone was waiting for. A randomized control trial where men took 5 grams of creatine a day for 12 weeks, and researchers actually measured hair follicles directly. So not just hormones, they actually looked at hair follicles. They looked at hair density, thickness, and hormone levels alongside that, and they found no changes compared to the placebo group. Now, there are a few important things to note with this and a couple of limitations with the study. First, the conflict of interest statement. I mean, this is literally stated right under the study, but several of the researchers involved in this trial have ties to creatine supplement companies, including advisory roles and receiving product donations. Now, that doesn't automatically, invalidate the results that they found, but it does mean that we should interpret them with a little bit more caution until independent studies replicate the findings that they got. Now, the second thing to mention is that this study was done in healthy, resistance-trained men aged between 18 to 40 years who didn't report any hair loss, and I don't actually think that they assessed any family history of baldness or genetic predisposition to it. So while the results are very reassuring for, the average person, we can't say for certain whether creatine would have the exact same effect in those who are already predisposed to pattern baldness or are otherwise not classed as a healthy individual. So right now, the best science we have suggests that creatine doesn't cause hair loss, but like all research, it comes with some caveats. And in saying all of that, here's where it gets even trickier. Because if you scroll through YouTube comments or Reddit, you will see thousands of comments and replies from people saying things like, every time I take creatine, my hair starts shedding. When I stop taking it, it grows back, or it doesn't shed as much. So this is that gray area where the research doesn't always agree with everyone's lived experiences. Just because controlled studies haven't proven it, it doesn't mean that their experience isn't valid. And science always lags behind real world experience. And everyone is unique, right? So the general rules or findings of science don't always apply to everyone. But in saying that, anecdotal evidence also doesn't equal causation. And shedding or hair shedding could be coincidence, it could be genetics, it could be stress, diet, or even age-related changes happening all at the same time. But the truth is, creatine might act as a trigger in a very small group of genetically sensitive people. But right now the evidence is limited and it's not a universal effect. So because there are so many things that can actually affect hair shedding, I did want to mention some other common causes of this, and I'm not a hair expert by any means, but I have done a little bit of research into this. And creatine isn't the only factor to look at if this is something you're experiencing. So other common causes of hair loss include things like genetics, obviously, so family history of male or female pattern baldness, stress and poor sleep, nutrient deficiency, so things like iron and zinc and vitamin D and even protein intake can cause that if you're deficient in these, rapid weight loss or really restrictive diets, hormonal changes even. So thyroid changes, postpartum, menopause, testosterone, DHT shifts, all of these things can also affect your hair shedding as well as certain medications. So if your hair is thinning, it's rarely down to one single supplement. But if you do personally notice a very clear and repeatable pattern, like every time that you take creatine, your hair sheds, and every time you stop, it improves, and you've ruled out, all these other common causes of hair loss, then, creatine just may simply not be the right supplement for you. Everybody's biology is different, right? And listening to your own body matters just as much as looking at the research. All right, so I do also want to address some other common questions that I received related to creatine and based on what the current research shows as well. So one of those being, what about after a hair transplant? As in, is it safe to take creatine after you've had a hair transplant? So here's the thing with that. The transplanted follicles are usually taken from the sides and the back of the scalp because those are the hairs that are naturally resistant to changes in DHT, the hormone most linked to male pattern baldness that I mentioned before. And that's why even men with severe hair loss almost always keep that horseshoe ring of hair around the back and the sides because these follicles don't go through the same shrinking process as the ones on the crown and the hairline often do. So when the hair follicles from the backs and the sides are moved to the front or the crown, then they typically stay resistant and keep growing for life. But, and this is important, the native hairs that are around them, the ones that have been transplanted or the native ones that haven't been transplanted, they are still vulnerable if you're genetically sensitive. So if creatine did raise DHT in your case, it wouldn't necessarily undo the transplanted hairs, but it could potentially speed up the loss in the existing ones nearby or the native ones that were already there that you hadn't yet lost, if that makes sense. So that's why for people with transplants, it's less about the grafted hairs and more about protecting the native ones that they still have. So, if you do notice changes when using creatine, then it's probably worth monitoring those closely. Okay, so the next question, do I need to cycle creatine to protect my hair? The short answer, based on the research, is no. Cycling doesn't reduce the risk because the risk hasn't actually been proven. Most long-term studies use daily dosing with no sign of hair problems or cause of hair loss. So at the moment, the answer to that is no. And then another big question that I've been asked is whether the amount that you take changes the risk of hair loss. Now again, based on the current research, there's no evidence that higher doses like 10 grams per day increase hair loss risk compared to the standard 3 to 5 grams of creatine per day. The only study that sparked this whole debate used a short-term loading phase of around 20 grams of creatine per day, and even then it didn't actually measure hair loss, just DHT levels, so we can't really comment on it from that study. All of that to say, dose doesn't seem to matter for hair loss risk, at least with what we know so far. So here's the bottom line. Creatine is one of the safest and most researched supplements that there are out there. The link to hair loss comes from one old study and a lot of anecdotal reports, but right now there's no solid scientific proof that creatine causes baldness. Some of the best evidence that we have, which is actually specifically looking at hair loss or hair growth and the response of hair to creatine, does come with some bias and some limitations, as I mentioned earlier, and that was that 2025 study. So ideally, as with a lot of things, it seems to be, we do still need better research or more research to back that. But based on what we do have right now, it doesn't seem to cause baldness. Again, though, if you personally notice consistent hair shedding every time that you have creatine, then listen to your body. The gains might not be worth that trade-off, depending on what matters most to you. So if that is you, trust your gut there. For everyone else, the best approach is just to keep your dose reasonable, support your overall health, and not pin all the blame on creatine when there are so many other factors that can influence our hair. Alright, so that is all for this video, but as I said at the start, if you want to know more about the common benefits of creatine or the lesser known benefits of creatine, please go ahead and watch my other videos on that. I go into a lot more detail inside those videos. And otherwise, if you have any questions, please comment below. Or if you're one of those people who has actually experienced hair loss from taking creatine, I also want to hear your experience below, and it may help others as well, because I understand that, lived experience is just as important as science can be sometimes, and one or the other, it's not going to apply to everyone. So I love reading all of your comments, whether it's good or bad. I usually reply to them all. So yeah, please comment below. And if you enjoyed this video or you found it helpful, then please give it a like and subscribe to my channel so that I can keep making these videos. All right, I will see you in the next video.